pizza Western Zip right now. Is it the first?
We're having pizza in Westwood 7 because of the Italian flag. Yeah. So it's pizza day in Westwood 7. So we're gonna have cheese, mozzarella cheese, tomato sauce, and basil. That's where the first pizza came from, the Italian flag. Would anybody else like to read their thesis statement? Looking for a volunteer.
Yeah, I got this. Cold War dramatically changed in this. In the Marshall Plan for National Security.
And you write some what? Very good. 3 nice. You tied it together with a good why. Good thesis. And the thing about that is, after reading that, I know exactly where you're going, but you've also organized yourself. You know, your 3 paragraphs. Hey, when you got a timed essay, you want to have that basic knowledge. Your hand starts getting tired that last. Your hand is going to get tired next Friday. It's going to be tired. You want to have that. I know what my last paragraph's about as you're writing like this. I know people try to do their multiple choice and fill in the blanks with their left hand. Yeah, it always sounds like a good deal, but no one with left hand is so coordinated unless if you are anybody. Anybody? Okay, used to be, then you lost it. You can do both? No, just look at it. Yeah. Oh. If you're not sure I need to answer questions, don't look at it. So, one more thesis statement.
The war dramatically changed domestic politics.
Very good. The only problem is the Red Scare McCarthyism were kind of the same thing, but so just a little bit more, like maybe the National Security Act or something. But very good thesis statement. The big thing is just so it's organized and know where it's going. And so, for essay, context, thesis, background materials, talking about the end of the Cold War. You mentioned the dropping of the atomic bomb. Talk about American prosperity, but fear of communism. And then you have your 3 body paragraphs, which are essentially 3 short IDs. And so let's take a look at mine again. And so I have this, McCarthyism. My topic sentence will mention McCarthy. And then like a short ID, I will summarize how McCarthyism is about fear of communism. I'll give 2 examples, like HUAC or something like that. You give examples of the fear, and then what it led to. Next paragraph. Topic sentence, couple examples, what it led to. Next sentence, topic sentence, what it led to, and always bring it back to, okay, I talk about Truman Doctrine thinking because that was about the fear of communism, but the fear of communism, something like that. I put Truman Doctrine there, so I just thought as you could kind of tie it all together, and I could add one more little fact. The thing that's different about the DBQ, the examples are the documents. Now, here's the thing about short answer questions. Same thing, no topic sentence. You come up with your own 1 sentence, explain, example, what it led to. Boom, next one. Those are 3 sentences each. Yes.
We will not know what the
until you get the DBQ. And last year they had 3 different DBQs. Everyone, you got 1 choice, but they gave 3 different DBQs kind of randomly as way back the test. So you want all out the same DBQ. But that one, now for the essay question, you get 3 choices, and you get choices for the short answer. But the DBQ, you don't get a choice. They've been generally pretty broad, and people have done really well on them. Last year we had 3 choices and 2 they did fantastic on, and 1 bad for the 3rd of the class got that one. Sorry. That's one of the problems standardized tests. You get what you get. And who do we blame for that? Them?
Yeah.
I was gonna be Mr. Mahalish, but we'll go with that. All right. So, review session, take advantage of that. Tomorrow, I will, if you want to come in at lunch and ask any questions about that or anything else, go take a look at it. So for the review session, bring a review packet. I'll answer any questions, about an hour and a half, as long as I can go. But I'll answer anything you have. I'll go through a lot. And even if you have something down, it's really good to hear it again and you might have missed something. Or it's just it's just another review to go back through it. And it is good to kind of come together. All right, we're all going to do this and we're going to do well on it. And where's the test at again? The DoubleTree. You're all going to get your own room. I don't know. They have it's actually not a bad place. Last year they had decent chairs. That's always one of the big things I was worried. I feel bad if you have really bad chairs. Because after about 2 hours, everything starts hurting and you're uncomfortable. I can't be there. I cannot be around you when you take this. That's considered to be unethical. Huh? Since I'm one of the co-chairs, I'm kind of a big shot. I'm actually there when they get things lined up. I don't like to. No, but I'll be there when they lined up, and then I'm there. In fact, I usually start seeing people come, right from the phrase. So let's get to war. The Korean War. So we went through, McCarthyism. What were the two shots? What was the first? What was Joe 1? The bomb. And what was shot 2? Yeah, Red China, the People's Republic of China. Everyone called the Red China the United States. And who was elected president in 48? One of the biggest political upsets in history. Yeah, Truman. Oh, for McCarthy. No coincidence. Just a few months after. What did he? How many communists did he say was running the State Department? 205, and then what? And then what? Got down to 2, and then the thing is, there were spies. Who was the spy? Who were the 2 spies who were actually one spy and Faust? Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, and Klaus Fuchs was the actual spy. So there were spies. Now McCarthy was just, I'm going to attack enemies. Well, this, but that's why people believe there were spies. Mm-hmm. The polls are skewed to a certain type of people. They're mostly polls. So they skipped a lot of people. And they didn't have very good methodology. They just called and they just counted whoever. Today they have methodology where they weigh them, even though that appears to be kind of skewed with cell phones. It's a lot easier to not answer a cell phone. When I was your age, the phone rang, you had no idea who it was. You picked it up. Now you can, what the heck is unknown caller? All of you who have cell phones, which my guess is all of you, right? And if you get an unknown caller, what's the first thing you do? Hey, how's it going? I like when it says potential spam. Or I like when I get a call from someplace, like Freud, Montana. And it's like, what? Because that's where they got a phone number. So let's go and get to the Korean War, 50 to 53. So after World War II, Korea, which was a Japanese colony, 1894. Japan pulled out very quickly, and so they just did the same thing, occupation zones, and just set up the 38th parallel. Literally, Undersecretary of State Dean Rusk just went, middle line. Close enough. But the plan is, like Germany, they would unify. But just like Germany, after the Berlin crisis, they just established 2 different governments. So remember, after the Berlin blockade, well, it started with the currency, etc. So they created in North Korea, they created a very nasty authoritarian dictatorship, which is now kind of an authoritarian monarchy, under a pretty tough, hard-nosed guerrilla fighter by the name of Kim Il-sung. Yes, his great-grandson is now the head of North Korea. He's based, it's like this weird authoritarian monarchy. I want to be clear about it. The grandson is this kind of soft, been spoiled his whole life in a really poor country. He was a real legitimate fighter. Not a good person, but a fighter. And they left him with a solid dictatorship with an army of 100 tanks. He had been trained to fight. The United States left a dictator by the name of Sigmund Rhee, who hadn't even lived in Korea. The reason they picked him because he was opposed to Japanese colonization. They just kind of installed him with the say that someday there'll be a democratic republic, and they maintained a dictatorship. Didn't really have an army. It was just basically a few guards. They had no tanks, virtually no air force. And shocking everybody, Kim Il-sung, mostly on his own initiative, attacked on June 25th. But according to Truman Doctrine thinking, who's really leading this attack? Stalin. Stalin was surprised. Now, Stalin supported the North, sent equipment, and one of the great secrets of the war, he even sent fighter planes and fighter pilots. So American fighter pilots were actually fighting Soviet fighter pilots. The Soviets had very good fighter planes called MiG-15s. And over North Korea. Then this was kind of kept secret, but he still was surprised. He did not order this. He did not necessarily want this. But once it happened, he was kind of stuck. Truman was totally surprised. And their first response was, well, who even knows where Korea is? And then they remembered, wait a second. We were literally just maimed by China. Who lost China? We're soft on communism. We can't allow this again. So we have to stop them here. And so, for most Americans, did not even know where Korea was. Truman announced we're committing troops. There was no declaration of war. There was no congressional approval at all. He sent troops that were fresh and kind of fat and happy from kind of easy occupation duty in Japan and sent them there. And this was all politics, domestic politics. We didn't do it because if Kim Il-sung took South Korea and unified Korea, that would be a threat to the US. We knew it would never be a threat to the United States. They did it. They didn't want to look soft on communists. Now, you could argue we don't want an horrible dictator like Kim Il-sung to do it. So that should be something we should stop and stop that kind of aggression. But that's not the same argument as it will threaten the United States. In fact, they said that Korea points like a dagger into the heart of Japan. So they'll be next. Remember the domino effect? What? Just because it's a peninsula? So we had no idea to send the first troops in. Truman was pressed on it. So is this a war? Well, he really didn't want to say war. The Soviets had just exploded their bomb. Who knows how many they had? They had one and were working on others. But they might have more. We didn't know. And so he didn't want to say war. So eventually the reporter asked, well, is it a police action? And he said, yes, it's a police action. And that became the dark joke of the entire war. Don't worry about casualties. It's just a police action. A dark joke. What does that even mean? We're going to arrest North Korea? Yeah.
Every time people say, "This will work," but you got- I was there.
It infuriated the soldiers. That's why it was a dark joke. Because it was a bloody, horrible war that 2 million American soldiers are going to go to. And at least 4 million Chinese, and not to mention the entire peninsula. Yeah, that's why I showed it. Good point. It's garbage. They tried to avoid the term war. Yeah, he was at a hospital now. And so, what did the Security Council? Well, the Security Council, remember that makes the big decision. Well, the Soviets were blockading or boycotting it over China. They were boycotting it. Remember, the United States would not allow Red China into the UN. That's how come we know Stalin had no idea this was going to happen. Because he would have had his ambassador there. And so by boycotting, they rushed the vote through. And so for really the only time in the history of the United Nations, this would be a peacekeeping mission to stop aggression. Peacekeeping as in to enforce the peace under a United Nations flag. Under United Nations flag. So the military governor of Japan, and the occupation was just ending. He was also a 5-star general, led the American advance in Southwestern Pacific. Douglas MacArthur would be the overall commander of all United Nations forces. But he was the guy who ordered the troops to attack the Bonus Army back in 1932, and then had to resign in disgrace from the army, but then they brought him back because of fear of Japan. I don't know if I told you he had an extramarital affair. And so that he would have been court-martialed, so they allowed him to resign. That's against military law. So there he is. And he was already past what was normal retirement age, but he had stayed on, and he was there. And MacArthur, after the Bonus Army, was kind of already a hero amongst some, but he was a rabid anti-communist. And he claimed to be an expert on Asian history. He had not been back in the United States since 1936. He had been there the entire time. And so the first U.S. troops, fat and happy from occupation duty, were landed here near Daejeon to stop the North Koreans who were just blowing through the South Korean forces. And they were routed, just routed, humiliated. These are wounded American soldiers. They didn't have any heavy weapons, and North Korean tanks just ran right through. This is a North Korean T-34 85 tank. And eventually, the North Koreans went to this little place right here called the Pusan Perimeter. The South Koreans were just holding this harbor. The only thing that stopped the North Koreans, their supply. They outran their supply lines. Tanks began to break down. They tried one considered rush and just couldn't take it. And so going into September now, as Americans are calling up every reserve they can, and the U.S. Army was just beginning to build up. So they started calling back soldiers from World War II who thought they were out. Because here's the thing about the United States Armed Forces to this day. You enlist, you sign up, you enlist, they got you for 8 years. So even if you do a 2 or 4 year hitch and you're out, they still got you. So that 8 years is done. And so they had men who were, this was not in 1950s, virtually all men. They had men who had not been in the army since 45, and they got notes saying, you're back in, we need you now. And that's how they started rearming us. So they got old Marines called back. My wife's grandfather was in the Navy, and since he had the skills they needed, they called him back. Next thing you knew, he's literally like from Phillipsburg, Montana, then on an aircraft carrier. And he made it all the way to Japan, and then they let him come back because his wife just had a child. His uncle. That just kind of thing happened. But the most famous would be maybe the greatest hitter in Major League Baseball history, Ted Williams. He fought in World War II, was a pilot, and they called him literally in the middle of the season for the Red Sox. He had to go back, and that's he's a training fighter pilot. They called him right out. And so like he missed some of his prime years. Just an example. One of the great actors, Jimmy Stewart, was called back, and next thing you know, he's flying bombers. Because he needed anybody. So MacArthur was looking at this as they're scrambling to get reinforcements, and they're sailing across the Atlantic. And most people said, just land him here and push him back. MacArthur came up with a brilliant idea. He had instances of terrible mistakes and brilliance, I guess, like everybody else. They're overextended. The capital's here. Let's attack up here and outflank them. Nobody said it would work. And it was maybe his greatest success in his entire career from World War I through World War II. It's called the Incheon Landing, right here. It's a little harbor city for the city of Seoul. They landed here, a Marines landing. They had to climb over a seawall, so that's why they have ladders. It took the North Koreans completely by surprise. And they took Seoul like that, and the North Koreans could do nothing but run away. Then MacArthur screwed up. Instead of cutting off the retreat and destroying their army, he decided to pull out the Marines and land up here. And that allowed the North Koreans to escape. But war is won. North Korea, their army is decimated. Men survived, they lost all their equipment. South Korea is saved, it's over. But MacArthur's mandate was to destroy the North Korean army. So he decided, not really against order, just it's complex. But on his own, he invaded. And they eventually went all the way up to the Chinese border. The Yalu River is the border between China and North Korea, taking the capital. And Truman got really scared because Mao Zedong of the brand new People's Republic of China saw this as a direct threat against him and said, I will not allow an enemy that close, and threatened to attack. Now, China has almost no heavy equipment, like artillery or tanks. A lot of men. A lot of men. These are American troops up here near the Yalu, really mountainous, rugged territory. They even sent reconnaissance missions into China. And the other thing, really bad thing is, if you look at this map, you'll notice that the latitude of Tokyo and Korea are about the same. And they thought the weather here would be pretty moderate. They had no idea. Korea's weather is extreme. In the summer, it's incredibly hot, and in the winter, bitterly cold. By November, it was 30 and 40 degrees below zero. It was a nightmare. I don't know if your grandpa talked about that. The extreme was just unreal. And they basically had summer gear. They didn't have the supplies. They were just freezing to death. And that's when the Chinese attacked. Oh no, I jumped the gun. MacArthur even flew to Wake Island for the first time he ever met President Truman. Here they are. By the way, they're smiling. Do you think they liked each other? Absolute hatred. MacArthur thought Truman was a two-bit failed haberdasher, hat salesman. And Truman looked at MacArthur as this grandiose, braggart, liar, dishonest person. I would have kicked him out of my unit in World War I kind of thing. And they met. And MacArthur assured him, I know China will never attack. Don't worry about it. And Truman decided, well, we're winning. Midterm elections are coming up. I'll let it go. MacArthur hid from Truman that American forces were already capturing Chinese forces in North Korea as they were sending troops over the Yalu. He didn't tell them. He didn't tell Truman that. And that's when, just 2 days before Thanksgiving, they had big plans for Thanksgiving dinner. The thought was, you'll be home by Christmas. Up here, the Chinese attacked. And it was a total surprise. They took the Americans and never should have. The Americans and mostly South Korean. I should add, Britain sent like 8,000 troops. Canada sent about 2,000. Turkey sent a brigade. A few countries sent things. Luxembourg sent like a squad. Literally like 7 men. These countries sent, but it was mostly South Korean draftees and American draftees. They totally surprised the American and South Korean forces. And this is arguably the biggest American defeat since the Battle of Little Bighorn. They got behind the American lines and it turned into a rout. And the army just ran away. The Marines were cut off here, a place called the Chosin Reservoir, and just barely were able to pull out. It was one of the most decisive defeats in American history. And the Chinese eventually would push them all the way back here and take Seoul again. Then their supply lines fell apart. The Chinese didn't have a lot of the modern technology, but they had warm weather gear, and they used bugles to announce their attacks. They didn't have radios. So I talked to veterans. I remember talking to veterans of the Korean War, and they would say how they would have bad dreams about bugles because they hear bugles at night. They'd attack at night because American airplanes couldn't come out then, and the bugle meant Chinese. So it was just bugles would like trigger this. I can't understand, but I can, because I wasn't there, but at least I know what they're talking about. So MacArthur, furious, embarrassed, immediately announced we should use atomic bombs. We should bomb Beijing. He would have said Peking then. We should lay a carpet of radiation on the Yalu, and if the Soviets do anything, we should bomb Moscow. So he's talking World War III. And Truman was furious. And because MacArthur was embarrassed and totally, MacArthur lied and screwed up. And eventually in 51, Truman fired him. These are Marines retreating at Chosin. These are Chinese forces attacking. So he's talking to me literally about World War III. Truman ordered him to shut up. He refused to do it. This is going to cause a firestorm back in the United States. MacArthur is going to come back, and he's going to be a hero of, now more and more they start saying people who were rabidly anti-communist is right wing. And these were, you can imagine, a lot of Republicans because Truman was a Democrat, but also there were a lot of Democrats. And he had a massive ticker tape parade. He addressed a joint session of Congress. Here's a cartoon, for example, the little man in the White House, implying here's Truman. I'm running the war like a little kid and firing the glorious war hero. Things like that. People thought he might run for president. In fact, he thought the Republicans would nominate him for president in 52. And so MacArthur came back, and so there were a lot of people like, yeah, we should use atomic bombs. Let's do it. Let's end it now. A lot of people don't realize what atomic bombs will do. They just don't know to this day. But eventually, new General Matt Ridgway would come over. UN forces pushed him back to this line here and dug into stalemate. So the war changed now to just hold out. The Chinese and North Koreans up here, then UN here. Here are American forces on the trench line, and basically became a fight on who can take the high ground. And it would last for 2 years. A horrible, horrible statement. Korea. Bloody, awful statement. And while this is going on, the 50s were starting. And a time of unprecedented affluence, and the first McDonald's. In what city? San Bernardino, California. But that's not it, because they tore down the first McDonald's. I would go to San Bernardino. I would have no other reason for San Bernardino. But I would go to the first McDonald's just to go to it. This is in Omaha. When they start making these first ones, I like the old stuff. I got to admit, I kind of like McDonald's. It was a big treat when I was a kid, so I kind of like it. I don't eat there very often, but I like it. I like just plain McDonald's. They're good for you.
Yeah, super.
Okay, so we'll come back to this. I missed this little cook guy. So during the war, there was an election. The election of 1952. And even though MacArthur thought he would be swept in with anti-communism, him threatening nuclear war scared a lot of people. And once Dwight Eisenhower, the hero of the European theater, he was the first commander of NATO, when Eisenhower literally basically said, you know, maybe I will be president. Got to figure out what party I am. Okay, I'll be a Republican. He really didn't vote. He didn't know. He would run. Now, he was a liberal Republican. He supported most of the New Deal, but for the most part, a liberal, economically liberal Republican. That's why he picked a young and up-and-coming Richard Nixon. And Nixon, who gained power in HUAC, accusing people of being communists, in 1950, he ran for the Senate in California and did classic, remember that term, red baiting? It was classic, accusing his opponent, Helen Dahan Douglas, of being a communist, and called her the pink lady and things like that, just attacking her. And there's a lot of also sexism involved in there too, but would win by red baiting. So this, they thought, would appease the more conservative elements in the party. You see this a lot. Both, campaigns do this. And so that's Eisenhower. And Eisenhower is basically running as, hey, be like Ike. That was his nickname. Eisenhower was very prominent. The Democrats ran the governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, an incredibly eloquent speaker, considered one of the great orators of that era. Didn't come across very well on TV, though. And TV was literally becoming important. Eisenhower didn't either, but Oh, and I also think this is really funny. The handing out packs of cigarettes with the candidate. Hey, this was a time when cigarettes were supposed to be healthy. You know, you take cigarettes will cause, you know, in case you have like breathing issues, help you. Cigarettes will help. They would even market cigarettes for helpful for women who are pregnant because they're helpful for women. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Kind of mind-boggling, isn't it? But what they really pushed on, the Democrats are soft on communism. Communism, enemy number one. And they said, Truman screwed up in Korea, and that's how come there's stalemate. I should add, it's kind of weird to say that Truman and the Democrats are soft on communism when they sent 2 million soldiers to fight communism. How else? I mean, I guess that's why we should have blown the world up. And that gets to show you that this is all just pure politics. It's just domestic politics to play on people's fears. And one of the biggest fears was called the bomber gap. Republicans said that through Democrats' either treason or ineptitude, they allowed the Soviets to have more long-range bombers to fly over the Arctic and hit us with their new atomic weapons. And because of, this is the middle of McCarthyism, the fear of the Soviets, the seeming feeling that the Soviets were winning, people believed it. And so the United States bomber force, well, it included a number of things. We still had 1,000 B-29 bombers, the plane that dropped the atomic bomb, and an improved version called the B-50 that had longer range. That from bases in Germany or Japan could hit most parts of the Soviet Union. We had over 1,000 of those. The United States had also made, and we had over 300 of these planes called the B-36 Peacemaker, the biggest by wingspan production plane ever made. Look at the comparison between the two planes. It had 6 pusher propeller engines and 4 jet engines to take off. The plane was so big that it had 2 crews. It had a little galley and sleeping quarters for one crew while the other crew flew. It was so big, they actually would attach small planes underneath it to launch them, fighter planes and reconnaissance planes. It had a range of 12,000 miles. Look at the comparison of a person next to this. This massive plane. We had 300 of those. They were just making a new jet bomber called the B-47, and they were literally about ready to produce a plane called the B-52, which we still use today. So maybe the best plane ever made. In fact, there's been 2 bombers made to replace the B-52, and the B-52 is going to outlast them both, B-1 and B-2. So that's a pretty efficient plane. Also shows how those other planes work. Good, but we had that. How many planes did the Soviet Union have that could fly to the United States from bomb? Anybody want to guess? Yes. Yeah, 0. Not a 1. This is what we call a lie. Eisenhower knew it was a lie. Truman knew it was a lie, but couldn't say anything because of national security. They knew they didn't have this, but it worked because people believed it. Gee, I wonder if a certain campaign would do this in 1960. Use the Republicans. Yes, Kennedy would do the same thing 8 years later. A new weapon. So it worked. And one more thing, TV. This is the first one, well, the first campaign where mass use of television. In the Democrats, they didn't really understand. They tried to get bits of Stevenson giving speeches, and they just didn't work. Eisenhower, they hired an ad man named Rosser Reeves, who was selling like Anacin, aspirin, Bic pins, M&Ms. They melt in your mouth, not in your hand. You ever heard that saying? They melt in your mouth, not in your hands. They still do that in hands. He came up with that. They got him to go from selling M&Ms to sell the president. And they did a whole series of ads. Eisenhower answers America. Quick little ads, set this image of this caring yet intelligent man. And then I would argue maybe the greatest ad ever. This is the kind of ad we need. Because all they want to do is get it in your head. Bore a hole into your skull. Are you ready? One more time. This Nixon barely would survive. Eisenhower hated Nixon. But, you know, weirdly, Nixon not very, that's another story. Landslide, an absolute landslide victory. But because Stevenson went away from civil rights, the solid South kind of appeared, but there's a chip now in the armor from 48. Now, add one more thing. 56, repeat. Same thing, almost exactly the same results. Almost exactly. And so with that, Eisenhower was not president. And he promised to go to Korea. Okay, whatever that meant. But finally in October, they signed an armistice. A ceasefire. But this is a bloody, horrible war. Now, this is 36,568 Americans died. It's probably closer to 46,000 because we're not counting everybody who died from the war. But we're talking now about just massive numbers. Look how many Chinese died, North Koreans, a million Chinese, or a million South Koreans, 600,000 Chinese died. This was a bloody, horrible fight. And ended on this line, and it's still in the same exact spot today. There's never been a peace treaty. There's never been a peace agreement. It was just ceasefire. So today, technically, they're just a ceasefire. So they're still technically at war. And so every time North Korea, which is a very poor, weak country, well, poor, weak country with a huge army, old equipment, but huge, when they fire a weapon, that's a direct threat to South Korea. And that's why to this day, the United States still has 28,000 troops and a fighter wing there. Tactical air wing. We still have that thing. And South Korea has a massive army. And South Korea is going to remain a pretty nasty, brutal dictatorship until the 1980s. So the people kind of rose up. They just rose up in revolution. And they've got a democratic republic. So that, for the next 20 years, the United States is going to be really worried. Not just about Korea, but the big thing is we want another land war with China. Especially as China gets stronger. They all thought about it. Now, back home, Eisenhower called his program dynamic conservatism. And once again, whatever that is. What is the fair deal? It just terms. But it's basically preserve the New Deal. Not expand it too much, but preserve it. But there were big public works programs. Most famously, the Federal Aid Highway Act. You also see it called the National Defense Highway Act, which created, as you can see right here, the interstate highway system. It is called the Eisenhower Highway System, the 5 stars because he was a 5-star general. This is that was during the Johnson administration. But so this would set up a freeway system and not only justification for a modern highway system for a more car-friendly society. Yes, they would rip out mass transit all over the country because we have cars. What do we need trains for? And also for business. This is massive aid for business to move products around. But one of the big justifications were in case of nuclear war, we have to evacuate cities. As we all know, once you build the interstate highway system, there'll be no more traffic. So if you go to a place like, let me throw a city out, Los Angeles, it's so easy to get around. We learned something when you build highways. You build it and they will drive. They all come. It's kind of amazing. But it would be completed in the late, most of it, they still expanded occasionally, but the main highway system in the early 90s. So when I was growing up in Montana, they had the interstate highway systems, there'd be like parts built and parts weren't. So it'd go like 4-lane, it'd go to 2-lane, go out and 4-lane. So bottleneck and then go out again. That's what it was. On I-90, I-94, and I-15. Also, they expanded Social Security to farm workers and self-employed people. People who were left out of the original Social Security. And So they expanded it. They also expanded, they basically said that like health insurance would be tax deductible as a way to encourage businesses, and some did through union contracts at first, provide health insurance. But the big thing is the United States is really developing into a consumer economy. And so moving outside the valleys and streams, they begin to buy cars. But one of the big problems, because of economies of scale, once they started ramping up production, they could produce way more than what people can buy. How do you have demand meet supply? It's such a weird thing now because we have such supply shortages. Now, that's causing inflation. But back then, they were really worried about building too much more. And yes, we're going to have really bad supply problems. Prices are going to go up a lot more. Shanghai hasn't produced anything. It's the biggest industrial area. So this morning, the problem with that is you might be thinking, oh, I should go buy stuff now. And what would that do price? So it's a trap. It's kind of tough. But back to this. How do you do it? Well, one way, it's no coincidence, this is going to be the second golden age of advertising. So all the guys who sold the war against Germany will now sell cars and other products. No coincidence, the first golden age of advertising after World War I. And advertising is the fine art to convince people to buy stuff that they want. Don't need. Convince them they need it or more. That's when they started doing model years. Here's a Chrysler LeBaron. They sold model years of cars to convince you, you have a 56, you're a loser. You need the new model. And they make little cosmetic changes. One of the biggies is they started getting bigger tail fins, so they look like fighter planes. So by 1959, the Cadillac had a tail fin of about 2 feet. There's apocryphal stories of bike riders getting impaled on them. But one more thing I'll tell you, and we'll finish it tomorrow. What else you do? You make things that are designed to break, so they have to buy new ones. You make a disposable country. Here come the landfills. What do we call this? Planned obsolescence. You purposely make things so they are designed to break or be old. You just shift it around so they will break and you have to buy new ones. And before you leave, let me give you a classic example of not only advertise for things you don't need, but also planned obsolescence. I have one in my pocket. Isn't this a classic example of that? It's already old by the time you buy it. You better buy a new one. But I'm not going to lie. I do like having a little computer in my pocket. So. Huh? Yeah, that's the thing. You essentially, you like create a need. Because what is the idea of having a phone? Like, why would you need one? And then all of a sudden you kind of do. That's why it's really hard to compare prices and money today than even 50 years ago. Because stuff you need now you didn't need. Have a good day, everybody.
What did I miss?
Went over the DBQ. Oh, I think. And
How did I do?
was it 88?
88?
Hmm.
Really? Out of,
100?
that was way better than I thought it'd be.
No, as I told everyone, the big thing was just not enough outside information, but I think you did a good job on the documents. I think you understood it, so I think you're okay.
I also need like.
Yep, you need yours too. I put yours down and then I walked away from it, but I know I have it. What about you?
English? I'm not sure.
Yeah, for some reason yours got ripped off. Oh, your documents. I don't have the documents with me. I don't know what happened to them. The staple fell and I just had yours. You want here? Let me give you a copy of the document too. All right. That few extra copies. Here we go.
See you tomorrow.
Oh no, we already got this.
Wait, can I, last one I
You're
got?
trying to hoard these. Oh, anybody who does not have these from yesterday, grab one.
Wait, no, don't take that one. Don't take that one. This one.
So instead of just walking and putting it away, you have somebody else do it for you.
You're not gonna get hit or like, have like your.
If you were gone yesterday, grab a practice
No,
task.
that's not gonna happen. Yeah, don't worry about it.
Oh, I did. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I was fine. I just didn't do it. It's the practice test from yesterday. I know, yeah, we can. We have arguments too. On Friday. This one? It's Good Friday. No. Okay. Yeah, I was saying not doing it. I need to talk to the board. On Friday, today, I have to do it. Yeah, you don't have to do it. I don't think you see it. Cars are under it. That's what it is. Yeah, and I was thinking about it, well, I didn't want to do it. Yeah, I knew it was about no, I just think so. So for you to just happen on things that actually. That's why you just like ask me what happened. Yeah. Yeah. You get the complex first thing. Yeah, I would use the same tool. Okay. So I like so much. But my dad and I like.
What about you, let's go fishing?
Oh, no. Yeah, I used to think that we were on the other side.
Let me just go and just.
No, I want to.
I don't want to think it's called.
But also, like, dude, we are a corner. So that is homework. That's a corner. It takes you to know where you're going.
Hey, how we doing? So, if you were gone yesterday, you need this. You skipped? You did skip? You admit it? You hunk. Did you skip?
No.
See, some people care.
Some people don't get
Oh, we're throwing somebody under the bus. That was fun. Okay. So just have this done. Let's do it by Friday. And review session. When is the review session? May 1st, which is what day? What time? 4:30 a.m. It will go for 6 hours, and then we take a 5-minute break, and then 12 more. What time? No, what time is it? 6 p.m. That's when I can do it. So it's 6 p.m. It'll be 6:30, so I go a little bit later on Wednesday. As of now, auditorium, I'll open the lobby door about 15 minutes before, then I do have to shut it. I might move it to behind just because I'm worried a little bit about security, but I'm not that worried. So I went to the auditorium in case we need to spread out in a little more room. I could do it here, but it does get pretty packed. You know, there are 70 people.
Keeps it more comfortable.
And we did that once. One time we had 100 people. That was pretty crazy. Yes. Yeah, there are people sitting on the floor. There are these people helmet hiking. It was really fun. Yeah. No, I understand. Well, what I'm going to do really I'm really going to focus on the first 3 or 4 pages. Huh? And then the other ones, I'll focus on that and then the last page too. That, especially the last page and a few other things that maybe I didn't quite get to. I'll do that on Wednesday. Beyond this, I understand, but it helps. It really does help. The big thing is, even if you have a lot of it down already, which I hope a lot of you are working on it, but even if you have stuff down, it's so easy to miss stuff, or just to hear it again, or tie it together. and I'll try to tie it to something else. And also coming together and just all doing this together. So, and then Western Zeb, I'm having pizza on Friday. Sorry, huh? For Italy, yeah.